Chapter 9. Agricultural and Food Policy of Soviet Power in the Years of the Civil War. The struggle for bread during the Civil War was a particularly shocking, decisive task for the Soviet government. The food front was a direct continuation of the front of the Civil War. The bourgeoisie, including the kulaks, used sabotage, disruption of the most important economic activities of the Soviet government, disruption of food work, hoping to strangle the socialist revolution with famine. To win at the front, we needed a strong, numerous Red Army. First of all, this required bread, industrial products, equipment and weapons. Bread was necessary for cities, factories that worked on orders from the army. The success of the food policy of the Soviet government was essentially dependent entirely on establishing the right relations between the working class as the leader and the peasantry, an ally of the working class. As a result of the well-known decree on the land, the short course on the history of the CPSU-B says, the village increasingly became a middle peasant. The middle peasant was now the majority of the peasant population. The moods and behavior of the middle peasantry, which fluctuated between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, were of tremendous significance for the fate of civil war and socialist construction. The outcome of the Civil War depended to a great extent on where the middle peasant vacillates, which class will be able to attract the middle peasantry, the proletariat or the bourgeoisie. History of the CPSU-B Short Course, p. 223. The White Guard generals and interventionists in the occupied regions restored the power of the landlords, and the bourgeoisie took land from the peasants and returned them to the landlords. The middle peasant in reality was convinced that he was on his way only with the working class. The Bolshevik Party, relying on the poor, had a strong alliance with the middle peasantry. The most important measure in the struggle for bread, which determined the essence of the economic policy of the dictatorship of the working class in the relations between the two main classes of Soviet society during the entire period of the Civil War, was the introduction of a surplus appropriation. On January 11, 1919, the decree of the Council of People's Commissars on the distribution of grain and forage subject to alienation at the disposal of the state between the producing provinces was issued. According to the decree on the surplus appropriation, all the quantity of grain and grain forage necessary to satisfy state needs is developed for alienation among the population between the producing provinces. Collection of legislation and orders, Number 1, 1919, Art. 10. The kulaks strongly resisted carrying out the surplus appropriation. From the early fulfillment of the surplus appropriation, and hence from the proper distribution of grain, the successful fulfillment of military tasks by the Soviet authorities depended. First of all, Lenin tirelessly emphasized this in his speeches. In order to correctly distribute the bread, it is necessary that the state development of bread is carried out by the peasants strictly, in good faith and unconditionally. There cannot be any concessions from the side of the Soviet government. This, Lenin said, is the question of the whole existence of socialism, the existence of Soviet power. Lenin, SOCH, Volume XXIV, p. 541. The food discovery was based on the military-political alliance of the working class with the peasantry. The peasantry carried material sacrifices for the sake of a victory over foreign interventionists, over landlords and capitalists. The surplus appropriation was a kind of a loan of the peasantry to the proletarian state. If, in the first period, the party placed its hopes on commodity exchange with the countryside, then the extreme shortage of manufactured goods during the Civil War greatly weakened the importance of commodity exchange. Commodity stimulation retained some importance, mainly for technical crops. The successes of the food policy based on the surplus appropriation were noted by the All-Russian Conference of the RCP-B in December 1919. The Soviet state in 1919 received 3 times more grain than in 1918. We learned how to apply the development, Lenin said, that is, they'd learn to force the state to give bread at fixed prices, without an equivalent. We know that the peasant gives bread for a loan, Ibid. p. 569. The 7th All-Russian Congress of Soviets in December 1919, confirming the food policy of the Soviet government, noted that the mandatory deployment established for bread is the most expedient means of getting the state into its own hands. The food surplus is leading to the exercise of state monopoly not only in words, but also in deeds. Congresses of Soviets and Resolutions. Soviet Power, 1935, p. 118. The Congress indicated that the surplus loan was a loan, which later, when the industrial life of the Republic is restored by the workers, will be repaid 100-fold. Ibid. The Congress spoke in favor of extending the method of distribution to other types of products. In 1919, bread and meat were harvested by way of a sweep. In 1920, the distribution was extended to other agricultural products, oil, meat, broken poultry for hospitals and sanatoriums, and other products. The Congress called upon the working people to strengthen the fraternal alliance of the workers and peasants even more closely and to break up the White Guard hordes, speculators, hiding bread, and all the owners of bread, who do not hand over surpluses to the state, were declared enemies of the working people. For the procurement of bread in 1918, 1920 GG, workers were sent to the villages' food tashments and tashments from the poor peasants of the consuming provinces. In a letter to Tsurupa, Lenin wrote that unless a reliable army of workers was created to march on the village bourgeoisie and the bribe-takers, the famine and the death of the revolution were inevitable. Food tashments played a huge historical role during the Civil War. They were not only an armed force, forcing the prosperous village elite to carry out the distribution, but also agitators and propagandists of the party in the village. The workers' tashments, consisting of the staunch, best proletarians of the city, who had passed through a severe school of revolutionary struggle, and honest progressive people from the rural poor found a common language with the working peasantry. The success of food policy in the years of greatest stress, when in a number of volosts, despite the difficulties, the food sweep was carried out 100%, was largely provided by workers' agitators and food tashments. The tashments were an organizing force. They built and strengthened the Soviets, organized the rural poor and the rural proletariat. They were pioneers in the struggle against the kulaks and all enemies of Soviet power. They fought against banditry, with dark subversive work in the rear of the Soviet Republic. At first they joined battle with the White Guard troops on the front of the Civil War. According to the Military Food Bureau of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, during the period of foreign military intervention and the Civil War, several thousand workers were sent to the food tashments in the village.